This is No Hate Radio.
I'm no stranger to the rain. Oh, no. I'm no stranger to the rain.
So, here today, we are extremely fortunate to have two guests who come from different places in the discussion or thought process about the death penalty and its administration and the process of using it. These states where it is more prevalent, those where it is less, the things that we have discussed at the outset. We fortunately have remarkable input that can be given today by two different people. And I'd like first, Maria, would you introduce yourself and your role and what you do in relation to the death penalty?
Sure. My name is Maria DeLiberato. I'm the Executive Director for Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. I'm also a lawyer. I've been a capital defense lawyer for about 18 years now. And before that, I was a prosecutor in Miami-Dade County for about 3 years.
And thank you very much. Appreciate that. And thank you for being here, because that's very important to this discussion as we go forward from here. And then we have also, I think, an exceptional individual, somebody who can give us death penalty experience a little closer than any of us want to hear about it. Herman, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Herman Lindsey. I am the co-chair for Floridians Alternative to Death Penalty. I'm also the Executive Director of Witness Innocent, and I am Florida's 23rd Death Row exoneree.
23rd?
Yes.
Y'all catch up on that. 23. And that's post-conviction on death penalty, removed from death penalty on uncontrovertible evidence. Is that not correct? That's rather an amazing number, and that's one state. So the scope of this issue, I think, is kind of brought into focus with that discussion. Herman, thank you very much for being here and for helping us with this and for bringing your insights in. We also have an observer here, Reverend David Franks from Allendale Church, who simply wants to observe. He doesn't want to be a speaker in the deal, but Herman has said he might be. So let's start with this proposition. I came to this discussion, as I said, not having experience with it as a judge because of the jurisdiction of my court. But when I first was a lawyer out of law school in Texas, with my background from, as I tell people, I was raised in the Texas oil patch. You know, our fortunes rose and fell with the price of Permian Basin crude. Well, that was our lives. And I went to law school in West Texas at Texas Tech University Law School. Got appointed in Wichita County, Texas in 1975, 74, 75.
I was 3 years old.
Yeah, there you go.
I wasn't born yet.
Exactly. And I was appointed there with my partner, and we were appointed by a state district judge in a death penalty case. It was a case where the district attorney had elected to proceed to seek the death penalty. In Texas at that time, you had several factors. One is if you sought the death penalty and you tried and you received a conviction, you had an automatic appeal. That's true in most states. But you also had an automatic appeal directly to the highest court in the state, which wasn't for criminal cases in Texas, it's the Court of Criminal Appeals. So we knew that if there was a guilty verdict in this case, it was going to go to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Now, the facts of this case are not the kind of facts that provide any sympathy or any compassion, frankly, for the defendant. We represented an individual who, I have to be honest and candid to say was a despicable individual, and he was likely a serial killer, and he was, a person who you would kind of select and say, yeah, there's you a great death penalty case. Let's kill that guy, So we we were charged with defending him. Important, Maria, that you will probably seize on immediately, and you too probably, Herman. There was a mountain of evidence against him, 100% circumstantial. Now, it was huge. It was like they had to carry it in on a number 10 chain. It was so much, evidence, but it was 100% circumstantial. This becomes important in a few minutes when I tell the rest of this story. So the case is tried. We had a jury in the box. I think a fairly selected jury. It was very difficult to get a jury. It was difficult because in Wichita County, Texas, in 1975, there was not unlike today, there was kind of a eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of attitude in the system. But we did have, I think, a decent jury. But what happened in the case was another friend of ours was prosecuting it. The three of us had gone to law school together. We were very well known to each other. And we also knew the expert witnesses that got called in these cases. And the prosecutor called the most defense-oriented psychiatrist in the community, which comes as a pretty good shock when you think psychiatric evidence is going to be pretty important, and this fellow might give you some avenue to keep the death penalty off the table here with the jury. But as the case developed, that particular forensic psychiatrist, who I had great respect for, he's deceased now, but I had great respect for him. The only time I ever heard him answer a question this way, when our friend, our prosecutor friend, I knew that by calling him, he knew what was going to happen. We didn't. He said, now, by the way, this is not private. The man's name is Kenneth D. Stodgedill, Stogdill, State versus Stodgedill, Texas, 1975. But he says to this psychiatrist, he said, now you examine Mr. Stodgedill and you spend a certain amount of time talking to him, and so I have these questions. He asked a series of questions, and then he asked probably the most probative question. He said, is there any basis to a reasonable medical probability on which you believe Mr. Stodgedill could be reformed or rehabilitated, where he wouldn't be a danger to society? No. No. It wasn't equivocal. It wasn't hesitant. It didn't take long to get the word out. And we had very little to work with. Very little to work with. The trial ended, and as you know, in the courthouses, typically when the case goes to the jury, everybody stands up, goes out to get something to drink, goes to the bathroom. Before we could get all that done, the jury was back. The jury was back. Guilty. Sentencing phase. What do we have? What can we do? How can we do something for this gentleman? The only avenue we had, because he had very little family, had his mother. And we thought, well, if she can testify to create some notion of compassion for Mr. Stodgedill. At that point, we were seeking really to just get the death penalty off the table. That's all we were trying to do. In her testimony, which she did testify, she said that as much as she had tried to throughout her life, she couldn't love him at all, that he was a bad person. And as you might imagine, the jury didn't take a long time to come back with the death penalty. And as my partner and I tried to gather our books and get out of the courtroom in a hurry. The district judge says, Mr. Schuler and Mr. Windle, you're going to be appointed to represent him on appeal. And I'm thinking, did I do something to make the judge mad? But what happened, he later said, was that we had made such a yeoman effort to defend what he saw as an indefensible person, he thought it was the only fair thing he could do. Later, we're working on the appeal brief. My partner, who I can say this now because he's deceased and he won't have to suffer any consequences for it. When we would do these late-night research projects, trying our best to find something in the law that would help us, he would go out on a fire escape in our office, open the window, go out on a fire escape, smoke marijuana, and try to think of of something that, as he said, I can't think of stone sober. So he came back in off of one of these fire escape sessions, and he said, I've got it. And I looked at him like, what have you been smoking? I know what you've been smoking. He says, I've got it. He says, you know the evidence they've got against him? I said, yeah. Boxes of it over here in the corner of the room. He said, what part of it is not circumstantial? We start looking at it, and the fact was they had no direct evidence. None. Zero. Just this mountain of circumstantial evidence. Well, we write the appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which is a pretty conservative bunch. Some of them grew up in the oil patch too, if you know what I mean. Pretty conservative bunch. But we went down there, and they gave us oral argument on it, and they listened to it. I didn't really think they would do anything except write a good opinion and affirm it's what I thought was going to happen. Much to our amazement, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reversed the conviction, not just the sentencing, but they reversed the conviction because they made law, actually, which is, to my knowledge, you don't know what happens in the recent years, I can tell you that, but as long as you could count on some stability in the law, it didn't change for 40 years. And that was that no matter how high the mountain of circumstantial evidence, you cannot support a capital assessment of capital punishment on purely circumstantial evidence. You have to have some piece of real evidence. Now, the practical side of it was I went back with my let's make a deal hat on because he had been charged with an attempted murder besides this one. And I went to the DA, who was also a friend of mine, and I says, Tim, have I got a deal for you? Well, how about 2 consecutive life sentences? One for the attempted murder, one which also involved a kidnapping, stack crime, and one for this one. He never gets out. You don't have to try a capital case again. And I think that's what Stodgedale wants. And that's what we did. And as of about 3 years ago, I think he was still alive and still in Huntsville, Texas, in the prison because he had virtually no chance of ever getting a parole. So I tell you that long story, both of you, to tell you that my direct connection was not with an innocence issue. It was not with someone who got wrongfully convicted of the crime, but it was the time that I had a chance to look the system right in the eye and say, no matter how despicable Kenneth D. Stodgedale is, is it a civilized society that can only find one way to deal with the punishment, and that's to kill him. That's the first time I'd ever had to. I've been through 3 years of law school. I'd been practicing law for 2 years at the time, or 3. And it's the first time I ever had to face the issue of it isn't a matter of how bad the defendant is. It's a matter of what's our societal obligation to not be barbaric, as the term might be defined in the Bill of Rights. My partner and I know this, considered it a victory. We considered it a time when we had a chance to do good, when we had a chance to. It wasn't a matter of believing that the defendant could be rehabilitated, because we didn't either. It wasn't that. It was a matter of holding the Texas justice system accountable to say, can't we do better than just death? You know, we're no longer the Texas Rangers riding on the West Texas plains, finding somebody stealing cattle and hanging them. Hopefully, we don't do that anymore. Anyway, that's my story. Now,
It's a very powerful story.
having heard that story, Maria, I'd like you to start off this with what you do. Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, you and your co-director here. And what comments might you have on my old story that might relate to something we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, I mean, I think your story highlights so many things about the death penalty. As you were talking, I was just really sort of listening and thinking a couple of things. One of the overarching questions we always ask is not does this person deserve to die, but do we deserve to kill them, right, as a society, which is sort of exactly what you said. But I think the second thing that struck me is, you know, I've been doing this work for a long time, and there are a lot of innocent people who are wrongfully convicted. Florida actually leads the country with 30 exonerations. Herman is 23, but there were 7 more after him. Wow. And more to come. And so that's a big piece of it. But I've also represented a lot of people who were definitely guilty of the crime. And what I think the death penalty says in those cases is there's no room for redemption. There's no room for change. There's no room for the possibility of some sort of, you know, either reformation by the defendant, or even if not, right? Even if that psychiatrist was right. I have a lot of things to say about whether or not he was right. I'll be clear. But even if he was, right, can we, and we do know that as a society, we can keep society safe, right? We have maximum security prisons where people can be safely housed for the remainder of their natural life without harm to others. And there's a lot of misperceptions, I think, about, you know, violence in prison, and Texas in particular, because they do future dangerousness as a standard. Florida doesn't do that as a legal standard, but we know it's in the jurors' minds. So, I mean, I think your story sort of resonates with all the things that we're trying to say about why the death penalty is wrong. And so for us, our organization, we are a statewide organization. I'm the first full-time paid executive director. We were an all-volunteer organization until about 2 years ago. So we were able to kind of got a generous donation and some grant support now. And we have 3 full-time staff and then a really strong board of directors. And Herman is, of course, the co-chair of our board. And then we do have 3 now other exonerees on our board, 3 on Florida, including Herman, and then 1 woman from Arizona's death row who was wrongfully convicted.
This is just a phenomenal set of numbers to me. Historically, and I brought this up earlier in a conversation before you arrived here, I did, you know, some homework, some research about this meeting we're going to have today, and I pointed out to Herman, I said, the number of inmates on death row around the United States is definitely outsized in terms of black males versus everybody else. So it's, you know, I went to and I said, I think wrongful convictions must be cornerstoned in racism. Herman feels a little differently about that, and we discussed it a little bit. But I guess what I mean by that is I was coming at it backwards. I was coming at it from here's the result. The result is that of the people executed and those pending execution, the majority of them are black males, and is that indicative of a higher percentage of criminal conduct by black males than anybody else? Is it indicative of intense law enforcement in segments of the community where predominantly black people live? What are those? What are those causal factors? But let's assume that just because of the color of someone's skin doesn't suggest that they're more likely to commit a capital crime, then the system seems to be skewed. Do you have some comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the system is definitely skewed. And if you look at the proportion of black individuals on death row versus their, population in society, it's really skewed in the wrong direction. But more importantly than that, it's also the race of the victim. So I think what happens sometimes is the prosecutors seek the death penalty for a bunch of different reasons, but we know that more likely than not, if the victim is white, the state is likely to seek the death penalty versus if the victim is black. And there's lots of sort of studies and statistics that we're gathering, work together to try to identify these patterns. And it's, worse in different counties than others. But there's certainly disproportionate on race and also poverty, right? So to be sort of poor and a person of color, that increases your risk because the reality is people who are caught in the criminal justice system often come from a place of poverty, from trauma, from neglect, all of those things. And so that's how we end up where they are. But I think we need to call, and as a former prosecutor, I feel like I can say this, like we need to call on state attorneys' offices to really be upfront about the number of victims, the number of homicides that come in, the race of the victim, the race of the defendant, and when they're seeking the death penalty and not. Because I think, from a general standpoint, right, prosecutors become prosecutors because they want to seek justice. They want to do right by the victim. They feel like they're doing the right thing. And by and large, I think they try to do so. I don't have this sort of belief that they're out there just, trying to kill a bunch of people. But I think we all have unconscious bias. And so if they really were open and honest about it, and that's my frustration, and I've had this frustration with state attorneys' offices across the state. They don't want to share that information. They don't want to share those statistics. And so it begs the question, then why not, right? Let's have this honest discussion about the disparity, which, as you point out, is absolutely apparent.
It's very apparent to me anyway, and I see a gender gap too. In Texas, my statistics may be outdated. Please correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you're on top of the things that I may not be. But I think we had a female person executed in Texas maybe 3 times, something like that. Almost never that's my point. Almost never. And yet we have had a organized crime defendant in New York who was definitely in a box, was convicted of racketeering or criminal activity and ordering deaths and things like that. And he had done one of them, or at least one of them, in Texas. So Texas could claim jurisdiction over New York. It was such a powerful disparity. And the guy, I guess, was well represented because he agreed to plead and allocute to the whole thing if they wouldn't extradite him to Texas. Because
nobody wants to go to Texas, especially if the death penalty's on the table. That's
because he said, these are not my words; they're his words. If you send it to Texas, they're going to kill me. End of sentence. Here, I go to prison. Okay? I want to plead here. Well, I think that disparity that we see around the United States is a worthy subject to look into. as you say, investigate. Can we get an honest answer? When my friend, the DA, back in Wichita County, Texas, all those years ago, went for the death penalty in that case, the defendant was white, so were all the victims, at least the three they knew about, but they were all gay. So in 1975, including the defendant, so in 1975 in rural or small town Texas, the public pressure surely was a factor in the DA thinking, I'm going to spend all this public money to do this capital case when I got a deadlock on a life sentence. I got a deadlock. Court of Criminal Appeals wouldn't have reversed a life sentence in that case.
No, they definitely, I mean, I think, and they should, maybe less so now, but give more scrutiny to the death cases. I mean, Herman's case is a perfect example. The number of exonerees that we have, all, a lot of them came, I've represented one, Clemente Aguirre, who is on our board as well. And, the court looks at the case with more scrutiny when there's a death sentence. I mean, that's just the reality of it. When we were getting ready to retry Clemente's case, we obviously were fighting hard against the death penalty, but the sad reality is that if he was convicted and got a life sentence, it would have been a lot more difficult for him to get a reversal on appeal.
Sure. And I think that statistics will bear that out too. So from a societal viewpoint, you've said there are 30 documented wrongful convictions with death penalty assessments in Florida.
That's right. We lead the nation.
And I can say this because I'm a seventh generation Texan. It's difficult to believe anybody's got a worse record on the death penalty than Texas. So Florida has outraced Texas.
Yeah, in a couple of ways, and I think sort of what's shocking to me and to other people that I talk about, Florida also is the lowest and the only state in the nation that allows the death penalty by basically a simple majority. It's now 8-4. It was 7-5. Even Texas, in all of its days of executions and death sentences, has never required anything less than unanimous. And that's part of the reason that Florida gets it wrong so much. I mean, Herman's vote was non-unanimous, so was Clemente's. So all of the exonerations we're seeing, almost all of them, come from non-unanimous votes.
And I'd like to give Texas great credit for that, but I suspect because I'm culturally ingrained in all of it, that requirement for a unanimous verdict doesn't come from a high level of jurisprudential thought. It comes from we don't trust government.
Possibly, yeah. I don't know much about the history, but I know in the South, like in Louisiana, which is where non-unanimity also started in Florida, it came as a direct result of racism. It came as a direct result to try to silence black and brown voices on the jury. The Louisiana it was like basically enshrined in their constitution, like, hey, let's do 10-2 because then we can eliminate, if we happen to get one or two black people on the jury, we get to cancel out their vote. I mean, without question, that's why it came to be non-unanimous here in Florida.
Oh, that's okay. Well, I'll give Texas
so they can get a little bit of credit.
I'll give Texas a little credit on that. But the deal then, from what we wanted to evaluate on the death penalty, and what I'm asking both of you to give me your individual perspectives on now, is we've talked some about the history of the death penalty, at least the modern history of the death penalty. The application of the death penalty we've discussed a little bit in terms of it being skewed racially and gender and with respect to socioeconomic status. The other things that I had listed that I'd like to evaluate and get into, and it may take more than one session to do, but I think it's important, is if someone who happens to be listening to our podcast or in our circle of discussion says, well, I think the death penalty is justified because of, and the because of is the ones that I could list in my mind, and you certainly would have the expertise to do better than I, but pure vengeance, that is, this person did this bad thing to my loved one or whatever it is, so pure vengeance, retribution. The biggest argument that gets made, because I think it's socially acceptable to make, is deterrence. We're going to deter crime. And you even have the future dangerousness finding required in Texas because of that, because the theory is we're going to use capital punishment to deter crime. And the almost joking statement that I used to get from DAs is, well, at least deters that defendant from committing a future crime. But deterrence is discussed widely among people who support the death penalty. What's your comments about that, Maria?
I mean, the idea that deterrence is any reason is just, it's nonsense, if I'm being candid.
Well, that's what I want you to be.
The fact that, having done this work for so long, if somebody is at a place where they're committing capital murder, they are either under the influence of substances, they are either deeply mentally ill or incredibly suffering from a traumatized childhood. Like, people don't just people who have healthy, well-adjusted, normal childhoods don't commit capital murder. It just doesn't happen. And so they're not in a place where they're thinking oh, if I do this, I might get the death penalty. I've represented close to 50 people probably either facing capital murder charges or already on death row. And that's just not even in their mindset. It's just not. This sort of statistics bear it out, right? If you look at states that don't have a death penalty versus states that do have a death penalty, you would think then the death penalty states, well, their murder rates must be much lower, and they're just not. So we know without a doubt that it doesn't deter crime. Politicians want to say it sounds nice, but it's just not reality.
So you're looking at vengeance. I think people, they don't want to admit that.
I think that's right. I think the only reason to have a death penalty is that pure sort of visceral desire for retribution and revenge. And look, I get that. I've sat with victims, many, many victims over the years, both as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney. And I understand that, that desire. When somebody has inflicted such pain upon you and your family, I get the desire to lash back out. That's a normal human emotion, and I always encourage people to sort of sit with that and embrace that. I'm not trying to stifle that. But then let's take it, what's the actual result? Because all the death penalty does is prolong that pain. We can talk about that whenever we have, time in the conversation, but the vengeance and retribution is certainly a reason, and it's an understandable one, but it shouldn't carry the day.
And what other... I thought of only those. I thought of deterrence, which is what I call the socially polite one to say, and vengeance and retribution, which nobody really wants to discuss. What others can you think of that are used to advocate for or support or accept that death penalty is necessary?
Yeah, I think there's a sense that it's necessary to protect society. I think there's a misperception that people who commit capital murder are going to be more dangerous even in prison, and so that life within prison is not sufficient, which, again, the studies don't bear that out. We have, I used a wonderful former warden and director of Indiana Department of Corrections who just, all he did was study prison violence, and the prison violence statistics do not come from those convicted of capital murder and serving life sentences. Those are the most well-behaved people in prison because they have such little privileges as it is that they will not do anything to risk those privileges. So I think that's a misperception, is safety. And then I think sort of the last thing is that people sort of think okay, well, we can't possibly have all these trials, right? So if I have a death penalty, then maybe I can use it to force a plea, right? Which didn't really happen in your case, but it ended up working out. And we do that all the time, right? We say okay, he'll plead guilty if you give him a life sentence. And it does ease some of the pressure on the criminal justice system. We can't try all these cases. However,
ultimately, yours did work out that way.
Yes, which is great. And some of mine have as well. But the problem is there's not a requirement for the state to accept that. So if that's true, if you're a prosecutor and you're like, well, I need the death penalty as a tool in my arsenal because I have to be able to resolve some of these cases, then if somebody makes a life without parole offer, you better be accepting it. And that doesn't happen. I mean, the Parkland case is a perfect example, right? They offered 34 consecutive life sentences within a month of the arrest. And we spent 4 years, millions of dollars, and untold trauma to a community to get the exact same result.
Same thing. Herman, I'd like to, because I really don't have a script for this, but you've been through, personally, you've been through the process that ultimately determined incorrectly that you were guilty of a crime that was justified the death penalty, and went through this, what had to be a horrendous process. Would you mind sharing the story about that with us?
Well, reliving it. First of all, I want people to understand what happened to me. I am very grateful it happened to me. And the reason being is because I am very spiritual. And I believe that God took me through what he took me through. Just as he took people through in the Bible to be the voice, I think he took me through what he took me through to be a voice. And I'm very grateful for what happened to me. My case happened and was based on circumstantial, as your case, except for we had this much little circumstantials to stack up. And it was mainly based on a person who was the prime suspect in the case in 1994. And I must say that my case was a cold case. It happened in 94 and I was arrested in 2006. This person was also throughout the investigation saying that he didn't know anything about it. And then all of a sudden, the new detective took over the cold case, and he wanted to make a plea deal to cut some of the time off of the charges that he had at the time. And through his voice, I was convicted. And today we still don't understand, but my case became one of the first cases in the state of Florida history where all 7 Florida Supreme judges ruled that I should have never even been convicted. You know, it was an experience that, at the time, I could talk differently now because I could see why it happened to me. If it didn't happen to me, I wouldn't be here today educating those that need to be educated because, people such as yourself, Maria, that's been through the side of working death penalty cases and been involved in that can speak to people, and they don't take it so serious. But when they have met someone that's actually been affected by the system, the voice is impacted a little bit more. So I feel that it's very important that what happened to me. I sympathize with some of those ones that had to spend 35, 40 years before they was proven they're innocent. And it's a very hard way to live a life when the system that just convicted you have very little faith that they're going to see you're innocent. You have very little faith that they're going to change the verdict until something favorable for you. So I think that is the most dramatic process that each of us has to go through innocently.
It kind of reminds me of my favorite songwriter, Chris Christopherson, wrote a song saying one of the lines was, "It's hard to keep believing when you know you've been deceived."
Right. But I like to address something as far as the death penalty and using it as a deterrent, right? The death penalty, what people don't understand, if we go back in history, the death penalty promotes violence. Now, when we go back to the kings, every time when the king didn't dislike anyone or someone like that, or they committed a small crime, guess what? They did something against it, off with their head. Now we go back to your theory, the Texas Rangers. You find somebody that stole a cattle, you hang them. You know, so people these days, and most people, and especially these young guys in the streets, they have the thought process that you do something to me, kill them. You know, like that is the way you deal with justice. They don't understand justice. They don't understand, well, let the police handle it and let the person go in and do time and think about what they've done to me. Instead, they just feel like they want to be, because you got to look at when the government and kings that people look up to commit these type of activities, this is how they react to certain things. Like they react to certain things like, you did something towards the government, kill them. You do something, you stole my cattle, kill them. You know, and when you people, and especially younger minds, see that, and we see it all the time in the mobster movies and stuff like that. In the old cowboy westerns, I love westerns.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Gunslinger and all of that. You know, if you look in that, it promotes violence.
Yeah. So what we keep coming back to on No Hate Radio, time and time again, or at least I do, because I'm a big fan of Dr. Martin Luther King and most of what he said, and he spent some time in the Montgomery jail, and he wrote those letters from the Montgomery jail to people. But he also is famous for coining either that or adopting or modifying the phrase that, hate cannot stamp out hate. Only love can do that. And it seems that you're kind of espousing that view, Herman, that hate can't stamp out hate, that only love can do that. And that if you're going to be driven by hate yourself because you're the victim,
you're going to destroy yourself.
You're going to destroy yourself in that process. And probably not destroy those who may kind of deserve it, if we want to be real honest about it. And we don't get to say that either. But it's a powerful story that you have had, because you went through a trial in a system that I've been part of for 50 years, more than 50 years. And so I built my whole life around trusting that system, around making that system create a thing that I think some of us mistakenly call American exceptionalism, and that is that we are bona fide in our respect for the rule of law. You sure can't recognize it right now in current political environment, but there was the time when someone like me would never consider committing a violent act on someone who did something bad to me, because I have faith in this system, this thing that I've invested in, this thing I've educated myself in and been a part of. But you made a comment, and I think it's very interesting, that it's hard for you to believe when that system has already done something that in your heart and mind is wrong. I didn't do the crime, and here I am, and I've got to rely on that same system to exonerate me. And that creates kind of a hopelessness, doesn't it?
I mean, it does, but one of the things that I find is that I think we have a great justice system. And you, Judge, should know, out of all people, it's not the way our system is operating. It's the individuals that we have in our system and how they are operating. I'm sure you've had some cases where you's like very questionable about the prosecutor act or how the jury came down to that. And the bottom line to it is our system is broken because society is failing to realize their responsibility in this system and how it needs to operate.
I've heard you make, in your conversation with Reverend Franks and I earlier, if I'm misquoting you, please correct me, because I've got no pride in that, but you felt like you stated you felt like education was a big issue, that people need to be educated. They need to learn about how systems function and work, so that they don't make these knee-jerk reactions about things. Am I quoting you correctly on that?
Per our conversation prior to this, we talked about, we wonder why and what's the resolutions to some of these issues. And we spoke about how it is the way people are upbrought. We brought up, like you brought up in a rural area, and you're taught a certain way. I'm brought up in what we call the hood. I'm taught a certain way. So we're divided in classes or ways to thinking, and what we have to do is bring on education. So as Pastor David was saying, that we need to come to find a universal teaching that don't allows what we say to bring out reality or common sense. If it's reality or common sense, then we can get ahead. Everybody thinking, for whatever issue we bring up in the world today, we can have a debate. But after that debate, what is the problem? It's still the issue. The issue can only be resolved if the people in society change to view things in a more universal way.
To go back to our no hate radio mantra, and after all, this is no hate radio. Now, what we want to do is answer why and what are we going to do about it. I think why is a broad, massive question when you talk about the death penalty. It's just bigger than we can haul in this room. It's huge. I understand that about why. What are we going to do about it? Short term, we're going to have folks like Maria and you and others going out here saying, or the Innocence Project, or some of the other groups that I'm familiar with that are saying, in this particular case, I call it micro remedies, one case at a time. 1-2 cases at a time kind of remedy. I suggest this, and please, y'all shoot this down for me if I'm just on the wrong track. I had the Court of Appeals tell me once I was wrong. Anyway, that the macro solution, the what are we going to do about it on a big scale, and I think you said it in your way, I'll say it in my way. We're going to have to quit discounting humanities education. We're going to have to quit relegating civics and history and government to the second or third tier in the education process. We're going to have to quit asserting our own personal agendas on that education process. We're going to have to tell the truth. And friends, I believe that's the hardest thing for any of us to do, is to tell the truth. If you had listened to my first broadcast on No Hate Radio, one of the things I did was tell the truth that I recognize and know that I'm a person of white privilege. I am. And that's how I didn't deserve it. I didn't earn it. Nobody said, boy, you're just really smart. It's just there. And when I realized that, I said, so denying that's not the issue. The issue is I'm a person of white privilege. What am I going to do with it? And I think it's that way about the death penalty. What are we going to do about it? At a micro level, you're doing it. Thank you very much. Along with the Innocence Project, who I've been reading about that. Massive work being done by the Innocence Project and other groups. This is centered in socioeconomic imbalance, in my feelings, so that Lyndon Johnson, one of my favorite Texans, crude as he was, rough cut as he was, he had a vision because he came out of the Depression in Texas, and he wanted to have a war on poverty. And I think what we got now is a war on the poor. And it's distinctly different than what LBJ wanted to do in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the things that were supposed to lay the foundation, Head Start in public education and all those initiatives. What do they center around? They center around getting people to think, as you put it, Herman, in a universal way, so that we don't have to come from the viewpoint of the us versus the other. This person who's going to get the death penalty is not of my ilk, not my group, not my friends or my family or whatever it is.
Your peers.
No peers. So I don't care,
Yeah, and that could never happen to me or someone I care about, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and we are, I think, in a state in the country right now where too many agendas have been applied to the education system, and things people need to know and need to learn are being discounted. And I've said that before, and I won't be redundant about it anymore. But I will say this: that when people don't understand why things are the way they are, they're always looking for a quick and easy solution, and they become easy prey for charlatans and liars and people who want to take advantage of them. And somehow finding solace and safety in the death penalty seems to be an answer to the need, I guess, for a feeling of safety. The trouble that I'd like to raise with it all, about it all, the trouble with that, beyond the moral implications, beyond I'll use the term God playing implications of a thing like that, but beyond all that, is that the system can't be perfect. And so my trouble with the death penalty, and the reason I want to investigate, discuss it with people who are for and against it, is that to the extent we put one person to death, one who didn't do it, that person isn't the biggest victim. The biggest victim is society itself, because we have just degraded civilization.
I want to ask a question, right? Because and this is basically for people that believe in the death penalty to think about. One thing that God said is that we will breathe and we will perish. Now, that means that we are all destined to die one day and our body go back to ashes. God did not do that as a punishment. So my question is this, is that if we're using the death penalty as justice, and as you say, playing God, how do the person pay for the consequences of what they've done? If they're in prison for life, and I do not support life without parole, because I believe in rehabilitation. I've been on death row with some of them guys, and you wouldn't believe the changes. And some of those guys in there is not the same guys that committed that crime, and over through the years changed. They found God, and believe it or not, those are the guys that help police the prison system to keep the trouble down. But my question is this: if you have a child that your child just lost a pet, you tell that child, well, that pet done went off to a better place. How do you explain to a child that a person that just killed their mother, you just executed them and sent them up to a better place for killing their mother?
There's an interesting proposition, Herman. I can truthfully say, I never thought of that.
Yeah, because I'm gonna tell you something. Our fight, it's collaboration. One thing about our fight on all issues is collaboration. You have a person like myself that's been impacted. You have a person like Maria that knows all the data, that like the brain of the computer, right? And you have people that, such as the judge here, Mr. Dunn, that done actually been impacted by one on another different issue. On another opposite side. And then we have the faith leaders. We have to collaborate with the faith leaders to get these issues addressed. The faith leaders play a very important part, and I want to thank you for participating in this and taking up this issue, time to taking up this issue also.
Yeah, I so much appreciate everything that's been said here. Of course, a whole big conversation's been going on inside of my head as I've been listening to all of you and having responses and questions and all of that. And surprisingly, found myself back as about a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, remembering, I'm from California, and remembering the first time I even heard of the death penalty, even knew what it was being in my Methodist church and having, I think he was the chaplain in San Quentin prison, which at one time later, about 20 years ago, I used to go to San Quentin and talk with and help prisoners there. Not on death row, though. But what this chaplain did, and I was very young, maybe 12 years old, but came in, and back in California in those days, prisoners were put to death by gas chamber. And having him describe in detail the death of an individual in the gas chamber and how that happens. It so impacted me, that I just thought, how could anybody do that to anybody, no matter what they had done to get into that chamber. And then thinking that my own cousin, who was murdered, a black woman, and going to her funeral down in Watts in California, and the support of the community there. And just going through those experiences. I'm just kind of reliving those as you're all talking, and thinking I would have a really difficult time, Herman, with somebody who said, well, she's just gone to a better place. And I would say, too soon. And that in your grief, in your shock, that God is here with you, and that kingdom, that love is here with you too, as it is with the one, but that God is grieving, even though that person is embraced in God, by God, that God weeps that it's too soon. And then I thought about what we really need to do in this country is do voir dire with every individual and do it in depth. In depth. We do not ask enough questions in voir dire to see who's in that box. But to do that maybe on a bigger scale, whether from the pulpit or in our schools, of saying, so tell me about you. Tell me about you, and how you view people, how you view the death penalty, Tell me about you. You know, you may not know this, you may not have seen, but just down the street by our civil court, there's 12 chairs. It's out on the lawn. In this sculpture, the jury, and each of those chairs is a different shape, a different character. And right on the corner of the street is one chair facing all those other chairs. And I think I would ask people, go sit in one of those 12 chairs. And after you've done that, go sit in the chair that faces all of them. I think it's only until we do a clear education of helping people learning how, as I was sharing earlier with you, Herman, of really learning how to discern and how to ask questions. So I think, Judge, when you shared about your colleague and friend that goes out onto the balcony and comes back and says, I have it. What he didn't ask, what you had all been asking, was, what's in all these boxes that we can attack? Instead, he asked the question, what's not in those boxes?
That's what he did.
Yeah.
You know, to be able to come up with the question that opens up the possibilities. And I think helping people learn how to ask the questions that can lead to the bigger questions. And some of that is asking the question about their own lives and where their own story may indeed connect with the person who's sitting in the chair facing all those other chairs out on the lawn.
I appreciate what you just said. Herman, you've heard Reverend Frank's observation at that point. I think about juries. And I've tried, as a trial judge, I lost count. I tried over 100 jury trials. Now, my jurisdiction, I didn't try a case like your case. It wasn't something in my bailiwick. But I learned a lot about juries. I learned a lot about them. Your comment and using the example of every chair being different, we go through these voir dire examinations. I used to say the French call it voir dire, in Texas we call it voir dire. But anyway, you go through this process, and we have a bunch of scripted questions. You know, do you know the defendant? Do you know, have you ever been the victim of, this kind of event? We ask all of that. But I think Reverend Franks is right in this way. I think voir dire hardly ever gets to the heart and soul of the juror. And if our system, I used to always say this, we had an exemption. If you were over 70 years old, you could just say, I don't want to serve anymore. And I'd tell them, I'd say, if you're over 70, you can come up here and say, Judge, I don't have to put up with you anymore. I'm leaving. Here's my card. They can do that. But I always encouraged them not to do that. I said, because I think the jury system actually works the best when it has a true cross-section of the community. It's got the poor and the wealthy. It's got the black and the white. It's got the female and the male, or, the non-binary, whatever. A true cross-section, 12 people who are truly not narrowed down in some fashion or another. It's been my experience in those jury trials that I have a lot of confidence in the verdicts they come up with. Capital punishment cases have such a overlay of emotion. They're such a it's almost I think at least the one that I was involved with as a young lawyer, watching that process, the room is just filled with it. It's just it's palpable. You can sense it because there's so much at stake. I hate to diminish it by likening it to this, but it's like the late night poker game when the stakes get a lot higher, And
You said you was a judge.
and the tensions get high. It's that way in a courtroom. In that case, it was for me. In that case, it was visible. You could feel it, and I think people are not. They're ill-equipped for that. It's tough. It's hard. But Maria, I'd like for you to kind of cap some things off for us on the work that you've done. You've tried a lot of cases. You've represented a lot of people. You've been involved in a lot of fact situations. And I'm sure you've encountered people who are philosophically in favor of the death penalty, who believe the death penalty is the right thing to do, maybe because of one of those motivations. Those who favor the death penalty that you've encountered, is it usually on the safety and deterrence basis?
Yeah, I think so. And on vengeance and retribution. I mean, I think when they're being sort of honest, and I have people, and I also give people that sort of permission, right? When I'm talking to people about the death penalty, I'm like, I just want to know the truth, right? I love voir dire, and my sort of goal, and it's sort of interesting that we mentioned this, I mean, that is how we eventually end the death penalty, is we voir dire every single person in the state of Florida. And so that is sort of what we're trying to do at Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. So we are trying to talk to every Floridian, because when we do, and when we have the dialogue that we're having here today, those reasons that they think they're in favor of it, they really falter. And when we find out, when I sort of explain and we can show them what cost savings, what we can actually do if we eliminate the death penalty, how we can put more money and resources into education, into protecting children, into all of the things that actually reduce crime on the whole, that's how we make Florida safer. And it's interesting for me. I'm so passionate about this issue, and I have so many reasons why the death penalty is wrong, and I've had clients executed and all of those things. Yet, we're right. We're on the right side of this fight. I mean, there is no credible reason to retain the death penalty. I mean, if you look at the United States in general, right, and only pockets of the United States are using the death penalty. I mean, 9 states, right, that are actually actively using it. 3 to 5 that are really executing people. But you look at the rest of the world, we're in the company of Saudi Arabia and China and things those aren't the company that the United States generally wants to keep, right? And if you look at just sort of take a broad-based view, is we don't want to align, we typically don't want to align ourselves with those nations and the principles that they stand for. And yet, with the death penalty, we do. And so I think that the idea is I can appreciate that there are some people that in theory are they read about a crime, right? They read about, and our media doesn't help sometimes, right? They sensationalize violence, and we are a country that sensationalizes violence. And we can have a whole separate conversation about why that's wrong, right?
I got 2 sentences for that. Our country has a radically violent and racist past, and we don't want to admit it, but it's the truth.
Yeah, and we also sort of still embrace that, right? I mean, look, you look at Netflix, true crime podcasts and all of it, right? And I'm guilty of it too. I'm not saying that I'm above that. I can appreciate it. And yet, if we could actually take a step back and look at it, when we really dig into these cases, even the ones that look like the most horrific, heinous crimes, when you look at the people and where they came from and all the ways that society failed them along the way, I mean, and like Herman said, plus sometimes for these guys, the first time they get to death row is the first time in their life that anybody cared about them. And that's just, that is an abject failure as a society.
Yeah, it is. And it is for sure. You were talking about 7 or 8 states. I'm kind of a statistics nerd in some ways, but states that don't have the death penalty that you think might, New York is an example of a state where if I was just going to conceptualize a state where I would think they'd have the death penalty because they had such a massive mafia, organized crime, environment for so long, and they had, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and all the rhetoric and history that goes with it, and yet they don't have a state-level death penalty in New York. It doesn't surprise me if Vermont doesn't have a death penalty. You understand what I'm saying? It's those that kind of seem like outliers to me, and yet their crime statistics, these states here in our part of the country, in Florida and Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi, where we, as a society, we embrace it. We say this is how you deal with heinous crime. I think I'm hearing you say, Maria, that your statistical study, your knowledge, your information, your historical references, that's just not true.
Yeah, there's just no correlation between use of the death penalty and the murder rates. I mean, there's just not. Anybody can try to tie these statistics together, but when you really look at it, it's not in any way related, because you have states that don't have a death penalty that have a lower crime rate, and you have high. It's just there's no correlation back and forth, and so it's just not a credible argument. But we can sort of talk about like what having these executions and having the death penalty on the books does in those states and what it takes away from. I mean, when you look at sort of Florida and the money it spends on education versus the money it spends on trying to execute people, right? Like, I'm just saying, like, we can think about our priorities and where they are. So the money that we're using to retain a death penalty, those cost savings could just be put right back into the community, and they're just not. And so I think that's a comparison that needs to be addressed.
Is there an average cost current? I know what it was in 1975. Is there an average cost today from arrest to execution? Is there an average for a capital case?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the numbers sort of at my fingertips in terms of what the average is. I can tell you what we know from the Parkland case, which is obviously an incredibly large case, right? That's a broader scale. I can appreciate that. But, we know the costs just to maintain and supervise him in the county jail was the sheriff submitted a bill for well over $1 million, probably close to $2 million. And so that's just for that tiny piece. And you're talking about the state attorney's salaries and the judge's salaries and courtroom personnel. And I get it that that's a broad scale, but just in general, in the cases that I have that I've sort of worked on, we can talk about each stage is more expensive. You absolutely must have 2 lawyers in a death penalty case. You are entitled to a lawyer from the moment you're arrested until your execution, natural death, or release. That is not true in other cases. Florida has a state post-conviction agency. I worked there for a very long time. Their sole job, there's 3 offices, is to represent people already convicted and sentenced to death. And their budget is, a couple $1 million a year each, so probably around $10 million or so. That is $10 million that the state of Florida would save tomorrow if they eliminated the death penalty just on those state cases. I mean, I could go on and on about it, but there is real tangible money to be saved when we can replace it with life without parole. We don't need to build more prisons to do that, right? We already have those facilities. There's no reason you couldn't convert death row, UCI, and Florida State Prison and just have that be life without parole. And, we can have a separate conversation about whether that's the appropriate standard, but I will be candid, having done this work for a really long time as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, there are some people that have to be separated from society forever. And that's just the reality. And I'm okay with that, and I will say that. Herman is also absolutely correct that there are some people that have committed heinous crimes at 15, 16, 17, any age really, and have completely changed. And I do think that, at some point we should think about a mechanism for that, but I'm okay with life without parole being the default option if we're going to remove the death penalty. I think that's just necessary for where we are, because I do think there are people for any number of reasons. It might be because of mental illness, it might be because of other things, but do sort of have to be kept separate, humanely, safely away from society.
That's hence the name Floridians for alternatives to the death penalty, correct? Because I'm casting a personal reflection again on it, but my thought about Mr. Stodgdale was he did not belong in society.
And I've certainly represented clients that I would put in that category. And I've represented clients who I would let live next door to me who I know committed heinous acts but are not the same person that they were 30, 40 years ago. So I've had both of those experiences. But I think we have to have the alternate default be without parole, and then we can move forward from there.
Herman, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to say something that I feel is very important, and it's what you said about society has said this is acceptable. I don't really think society accepts this. I think what's happening is a lot of people don't know the power of the individuals in society, and I think that because a lot of people run away from problems and say, well, it's not my concern or it's not going to happen to me, I don't think they fully understand the power they have if they pull together and vote correctly, express their views to the legislators or the elected officials. And I think that's what needs to be a big part of this fight.
Herman, thank you. So let me ask each of you to do something. If you have one single message that Maria wants to give today to whoever listens now or in the future to this podcast, what would it be?
I want you to go to our website, www.fadp.org, and I want you to sign up for our action, which is not in our name. So I want you to add your name to the list to say, we don't need the death penalty to be safer. Not in our name will this happen. And two things. You said one, but I'm going to sneak in a second.
That's okay.
I'm asking, and I am available, and Herman is available, and our board members are available. I will come and speak to your congregations, to your civic groups, to your high school class, to your college class. I want to have this conversation. I want to speak to every single Floridian. So if you have a group and you're like, this is really interesting, I want a speaker, call me. I'll come. I've got a number of people that will come. Thank
you, Maria. Herman, is there one more? You just said something pretty powerful about people, but is there some way you would like to conclude this broadcast today?
I would like to say to people in society to understand the power that you have. When I was sentenced to die, they said, we, the people of the state of Florida, hereby sentence you to die by lethal injection. And half of the people in Florida didn't even know who I was.
That's true.
So I want people to understand the power that they have, and most important, to understand and accept the accountability and responsibility of being a juror so that people such as myself won't be wrongfully convicted.
Herman, thank you. Reverend Franks, closing remark.
There's a quote from James Baldwin. I cannot let this quote go. It's been hanging on to me for a couple of weeks now. And it simply says this: love has never been a popular movement, and no one's ever wanted really to be free. The world is held together, really, it is held together by the love and the passion of a very few people. And I see sitting across from me two of those people.
That's true. That's true. And with that, I would like to close this episode. It may be that we spend some more time thinking that there has to be another session because this subject is so long-standing, so huge, so massive. But I want to say on the air, thank you. Herman, you drove all the way over here from Broward County to be with us today. Thank you for that. I mean, sincerely, thank you for that. And Maria, thank you for you and what your organization is doing. Let me wind up by doing what I usually do and say, this is No Hate Radio. Thank you for listening to our broadcast today. We appreciate your interest and invite your input either by calling our message line at 442-4-NO-HATE and leave us your thoughts, comments, ideas, or suggestions, or send us an email by using the email link on our website or directly email us at nohateradio@allendaleequityjustice.com.